Okay, so this is topic 3 for information system security, access control. Some of the stuff we're going to be talking about, basically the factors impacting access control decision making, types of technologies that are used in network environments, um, critical activities associated with information classification, identity features and appropriateness of access control modes, understanding single sign-on, one-time passwords, and smart cards. Okay, from the book, what we're referencing here is from the Security Plus book, the Security Plus Essentials book, chapters 2 and 3. And then there's also a couple of videos, Access Controls Part 1 and Part 2. All right, I guess to start off, in the previous chapter, we talked a bit about security models. All right, so the idea is, the idea of a security model is we take a set of policies, we implement define a set of rules associated with that, for how we secure information, basically focused on information security. So there's two types. We talk about formal models, which are really mathematical implementations, very highly secure, but also very expensive, and a lot of work to set up. Informal policies basically are defined to express and execute security policies. In both events, basically both security models have two objectives. One is to provide data confidentiality, and the other one is to provide data integrity. So these models, these security models, are really based around a data model security. So in access control, the definition of this stuff. So it's really it's control over access to system resources after the credentials of a user, credentials and identity, have been authenticated. So basically, what do you have the right to do on the system? Can you read files? Can you write files? Can you access resources within the system? Assuming you want to ensure that you have the ability to control who touches what in the system. For example, if you're dealing with the operating system of the computer, which is basically a bunch of executable files, programs, whatnot, you really don't want people just going willy-nilly into that and monkeying around with things, because quite frankly, what will happen is you'll crash the system. So the idea is, those access to system-level activities are reserved for systems administrators and what they call root-level access, as opposed to anybody. Right? And ACL is, and we talked a little bit of this in the last section. Basically, it's a user list or information resources. All right. So the idea is, what you do is, for every resource, you define who can read it, who can write it, who can create it, who can delete it. As an example. All right. Different types of access control. So we talk about mandatory versus discretionary, and these are really two extremes. So mandatory is really the strictest of all levels of control. It uses a hierarchical approach, controlling access to resources. Everything is controlled by defined systems administrator settings. Not possible for users to change access control resources. You have to be granted it. You cannot adjust it. You cannot elevate your access above what you are assigned. Challenge obviously very tight controls. Problem is a lot of overhead associated with maintaining it, creating it, maintaining it, and sustaining stuff, because you're adding new users, you're adding new resources. Things change, on an ongoing basis. So this is the kind of MAC characteristics. What they use the term sensitivity levels to objects. So when you assign a sensitivity level to an object, a subject, what they call subjects and objects. So a subject is what's granted access, and the object is what that subject has access to. Um, so subjects with clearance up to object sensitivity level can access objects. This is kind of the terminology and nomenclature that gets associated with this. Basically, if you are the subject and a file is the object, you have certain things you can do with that file. All right. Once again, as we said before, only administrators can change this. You can also lock this thing down at all sorts of different levels. You can actually control access down to time of day, and user credentials. So there's things you can or source of where somebody is coming from. So you can be pretty granular and lock things down. Problem is that has to be defined and that has to be set up. All right. So how it works is you basically you sign you take all of your resource objects, you assign with security labels, which are kind of 2 bits of information, classification and category. And then for all of the user accounts, you also assign classification and category, same things. So what will happen is when access is you try to access the system, what you have is you're basically matching the classification and the category. Now, if they match, you can access it based upon what the resource, what's granted. If they don't match, you have no access. The opposite end of this is what we call discretionary controls. And what this is, instead of an administrator top-down, this is actually each user controls their own, control access to their own data and resources. So, resource object has the ACL, access control list, containing the users and the groups that can provide access and who can get at it. It's more flexible, but the challenge is it's obviously without a tight central control, it's possible that someone who should not have access will gain access. Characteristics of it, any type of access to resources based on identity authorization. So it's similar to Mac in that way. Unauthorized users have no access to the file. Principal users separated, protected from all unauthorized data. So this is, in a way, Mac and DAC are kind of doing similar things. Obviously, though, the way they are administered and deployed is where they differ. So there's a concept that gets thrown out, what we call role-based AC, or role-based access control, or RBAC. So the idea is what you would do with this is you define what we call a role-based access, and then which basically, for a particular role or job, certain access to certain resources are required. All right, and then you assign to you create a role, and then everybody who fits that role is assigned to that. All right, so it's actually it's simpler because what you're doing is instead of doing this down to an individual level, what you're doing is you're kind of creating something called a role, which is kind of an abstraction of something at a higher level, but so it's higher than it's lower than having a centralized control, but it's higher than just letting everybody kind of doing it themselves, being assigned themselves. So what happens is the role kind of constrains what everybody in that role can get, what resources they have access to. Another rule-based access control. It's kind of a similar fashion. You define rules, and associate the rules within for each object. Another one we have, and this is actually more of a different type of role-based access control is pretty common. You see a lot of it. I think it's actually probably more the standard approach. Attribute-based is a really kind of a new, more technical approach for access control. So the idea is, you assign assigned attributes of requester, attributes of the object, environmental conditions, sets of policies, and then you basically calculate what, based upon how the attributes line up. You make your decision about whether or not you would grant accesses. So this is kind of a newer thing. It's not quite as common as role-based. Role-based is probably the most common. Just some definitions of ABAC, attributes, subjects, object, operation policies, environmental conditions. So these are basically the terminologies we associate with all of the components that make up an attribute-based access control setup. So authorization. There's it basically, defines what you have rights to access. So there's really, when you're designing a security model or a security program, there's a couple core principles that you see. So there's a couple that you go in there, you establish. Most organizations will establish as part of defining this up. So the first one is what we call principle of least privilege. The idea is what you do is you only assign the minimal number of privileges required for someone to do their job based upon their role, nothing more. Nothing more beyond what the minimum is. Right? Similar to this need to know principle, only information that is needed to know. So you can't have somebody scanning, kind of looking for stuff and being able to find things. If you don't need to know it, you don't have access to it. Compartmentalization, prevent information flows, really kind of flowing freely across the organization. The ability to kind of control where it goes, who moves it, when it moves, how it moves. Security domains, basically all the objects that can be covered by a single security policy and a set of trusts. Roles, identification, who needs to do what. Data owners classify with data, determine who needs to get for proper data handling. Then you have another characteristic. So there's really three roles associated with data. One are the users. They're basically people who need to access it. Second one is the data owner. So the data owner is really the person who defines what the classification of the data is and who should get what access rights. And then custodians really is kind of a utility role that is defined primarily to handle things like being able to back up data. Separation of duties, segregation of duties, and really is designed so no single individual is responsibility for performing, an end-to-end set of transactions. So, the example we talked about, if someone is, has the ability to create a vendor, process purchase orders, and write checks, basically they have the ability to basically create a fake company, put orders against it, and basically send money to themselves. The idea is that from an auditing perspective, that would be separated. They would be separated into different roles. So people responsible for creating accounts are also different from people who are entering purchase orders, who are different from people who are administering the checks. So information classification. So the idea with this is really the information categories has appropriate protection. So the idea is that not all assets are equal. So if something doesn't have as much value, it receives basic protection. So you have a floor, and then anything above that requires a higher level. So there's three things we do with this. Number one, you have to set up a program. What is the classification program? Then you actually have to go back and label and mark the data, and then you need to verify that the classification is occurring correctly. Some sort of validation, so it's not arbitrary, or that it matches what the criteria or what the principles say it should match. Concept of non-repudiation. So the idea is that anybody who's authorized is also accountable. So non-repudiation means if something occurs that was done using your accounts, you bear responsibility for that. So if somebody was to gain your account, go in and do something in the system, you are still the person responsible for that. The way this is implemented is really through tracking and tracing, basically like recording activities, and matching it back to an authorized users. So a lot of this stuff gets done through you use these types of things in log analysis, look for detecting intrusions, reconstructing events, assisting them in recovery from unexpected control failures. So this is really the idea of a non-repudiation is important because really you're assigning ownership and you're assigning responsibility. Administrative controls, the bunch of stuff that goes into this. This is sort of like how do you run these things? How do you run a program? How do you set this stuff up? So a couple things, obviously, at the high level, what are the policies? What are the procedures? Defining all of that stuff. You need policies and procedures to make these things functional. All right. In addition, you also need to define from a personnel perspective. Who are what do people need to be aware of? What do people need to be informed of? What do people need to be? Who are the people and kind of what are their roles in the organization? And tied into this is this idea of an awareness. So we talked about kind of an education earlier, in our first section. So this is sort of awareness training, and then there's an ongoing effectiveness. Because the idea is you need to check, you need to verify that whatever policies you put in place are being followed and they are effective. So there's a whole bunch of different things that kind of fall into this. So within administrative controls will include things like hiring practices, termination practices. A lot of times, and I've seen this in real life, where somebody gets terminated and the account never gets deleted. Their either email account or their system account may be deactivated, but it's never deleted, or maybe it's not even deactivated. So the idea is that all is part and parcel of what you need to. If somebody is departing, they need to be. All that stuff has to be unwound. We talked about classification of data. What is the sensitivity level, supervision and activity tracking, the aforementioned separation of duties to make sure that no individual has full access for the completion of a end-to-end process. And then also another thing you see a lot of times is you rotate duties. So if somebody has responsibilities for certain areas, certain points, you kind of flip them to another position, and so if things would be happening, people get different. Number one, it's a good practice, but it's also something that can be used as to help from a security perspective, kind of identify if activities are going on. Maybe a different pair of eyes might be able to see it. Technical controls. So this is more of the on the technology side. So this is all sorts of all of these different kinds of things. So applications and systems and protocols and encryptions and security packages and all sorts of stuff. Really, and what it's designed to do, all of those things that we use to try to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of resources. So they take a whole bunch of different forms of network access controls. Who can enter the network and where can they go? Encryption protocol. Obviously we've talked about this before. Confidential and integrity of data. Control zones, which are similar, sort of similar to the network access controls. Protects devices emitting electrical signals. And then software-based auditing controls whatever activity is going on the network. So the idea is what you want to be able to have is an awareness and kind of a vision or some understanding of what activities are going on. Physical access controls. We always, thing to always remember security. There's always going to be a physical access to it. So it includes network, work area segregation. Includes things like guards, fences, motion detectors, locks, your basic physical kinds of things. Video cameras. The thing that's remarkable about video cameras these days is, you can basically the price of video video technology is such that it is trivial to set up video access. So basically, you can set up just basically capture data, ongoing, and have it available and to be able to go back and monitor. IDM, so this is a kind of a IAM overview, IDIM. So it's different identity services, which is a kind of an approach to how do you ensure somebody's identity, background check status. There's a couple different things that have come into play in this, and to verify that somebody is authorized to access a particular resource. It's some of the things we've seen before. It's another approach, another model. It carries a lot of the same characteristics as we've seen previous. Identity verification. This has really become a huge issue because, especially with the internet, the idea of how do you know who you really are. All right. So how do you, so from a fraud perspective, there was a huge issue for long as well where people were, using. There really is not any unique identifier. So the closest thing to an identifier, say in the United States, was Social Security number. So that became a kind of a de facto identifier, except that if people got access to your Social Security number, then you had all sorts of potentially you could be subject to fraud. People using your identity, false identity, so things of that nature. So there's an interesting development around it because it really is a double-edged sword. This idea of ideally you'd like to be able to prove you are who you are. By the same token, not everybody wants to have your identity marked so you can be tracked and traced. So it's an interesting dynamic going on. Identity authorization of users. How do you identify who somebody is? The difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is a person is who they say they are. And then authorization grants access to resources based upon what the authentication is. All right, so things you need to, best practices, things to look at, removing default users. This is a well-known attack vector. Weak passwords, eliminating weak passwords, another factor here. And then also, locking and removing accounts when validity within the organization expires. So authentication, we've talked around a couple different forms of this stuff. Verifying credentials to physical identification, with basically identifying client devices making requests. So this is where we talk about our three factors of security: something you know, something you have, something you are. All right. Traditionally, we've been using passwords, which is something you know. All right, but now what we're seeing kind of a rise of a two, and in some cases three. So there's what we call multi-factor authentication. So you see a lot of situations now where somebody will prompt you, to receive a text message on your phone with a key, which you then enter the key, which will then prove that you were the person who received the phone, was in possession of the phone number, so you prove who you are. So username and password has been around since forever. Most rudimentary, least secure. The weakest form, obviously, plain text communication where everything, both user ID and credentials, are transmitted. So a lot of this in early days of wireless, early days of internet, where basically data was basically passed as clear text across the network. So anybody with a sniffer or anything could capture the package. You could just take them and just read them. Literally, you can see names. You could actually see username, password in the message. So this idea of now where you see things like secure shell, basically putting encryption involving use like SSL and things like, for example, secure socket layer, is what you say with layers, basically making it an ensured encrypted tunnels for communication. Right. The issue around passwords are it's only as secure as the choice of the password. Well, you can attack a lot of different means and mechanisms. They're in the book. Brute force attack, basically you just guess it. You can thwart that by creating a lockout on your password. So after X number of failed login attempts, the account gets temporarily logged out, and if it continues to happen, it can be permanently locked out. But the more successful ways of using this stuff now, the more modern ways, is social engineering attacks, where somebody would just basically call up and ask people for their password, or call up, pretend that they're someone else, call the help desk and get them to reset a password. really dependent upon the acting skills of the person doing the calling. Phishing, which has gotten a lot of publicity, is that you get an email pretending to be from a trusted source, asking you to click something or download something onto your machine. So it's a, this is, sophistication of phishing is really pretty slick. They're really, what they call, targeted or spear phishing. The idea of they know about you, they know characteristics about you, they know people in your circle, and actually they will use that as the means of attempting to execute their fraud. Password policies, it's the key to open an account. Challenge is trying to get it hard, trying to define a policy which ensures a less vulnerable password. So so there's a lot of work around training, education, like best practices now is like the length of the password, the complexity of the password. So really, there's a password policy. Organizations create a password policy. It defines what should be the robustness of the password. So the complexity of it, the attempts, the change frequency, the reuse. So it's it doesn't you don't create one password and it stays forever. It's or one password with three letters in it that stays forever. So by defining this stuff, you want to get at least 8 characters, using combinations of letters and numbers and special characters. It's interesting because a lot of the stuff is new. There's a lot of ways of organizations have invested a lot of money in a lot of things, but obviously the big thing is really trying to wear. It's once again, people are the weakest link. So the challenge in password policies is making sure people understand and follow the policies. All right. So that's really that's the bigger challenge. No matter what the technology is, ultimately you still have to. It still comes down to the weakest link being the person making sure they follow the policies as they're defined. So just a couple things around this, policies, considerations, complexities, aging, usage, how many times can a password be used, and storage, password, making sure passwords are stored in encrypted, in some sort of encrypted fashion, so that if they're accessed, they cannot be utilized. This concept of something called a single sign-on. So a single sign-on is, the idea is that you will authenticate across some sort of central, some form of central authentication, and then the credential you get can be applied to other systems. So instead of logging onto each system and having credentials for each system, what you have is a ticket. It's like a ticketing system where you access to you get your first system, and then you get a token, and then that token gives you the rights to get to other systems. All right, so there's a couple things we've seen around here. There's a couple things we've seen with from a technology perspective, something called an LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Microsoft Active Directory is probably the best known implementation of that. Also, we're seeing a lot of stuff now especially with internet-based authentications and single sign-on. So there's what we call SAML and SAML assertions as a mechanism. It's a standard mechanism. But all of these, the idea is that you basically you reduce your vulnerability, at the one level by making sure you don't have one password per system, or one account, one password per system. So the advantages, obviously it makes it more efficient. So you only have to do it once. You reduce your support overhead, streamlines account management, centralized control. So you still have to. The disadvantages, you still have to do it. You still have an authorization. And the real problem with SSO is there's a lot of different applications that have different types of authentication strategies. So trying to deal with all of those different things can be a real challenge for organizations. So some of the terminologies we see with SSO, tickets, service tickets, is what you use for to get onto a system. Renewable tickets, so you can So the idea is that when the ticket's renewed, the original is no longer valid. Um, so basically your ticket is not a permanent. The idea of a renewable ticket is not a permanent thing. You periodically need to go back and be re-authenticated. Uh, Ticket granting tickets, access ticket granting services after putting requests, and forwardable tickets. You forward credentials to another service. So assuming that it's a trusted, forwardable ticket. A couple other things here. Kind of wrap this up. CHAP. This is actually kind of an older technology, challenge pancake authentication protocol. It uses a three-way handshake with credential known to clients and servers. It was something that was especially done with early on with dial-up networking. Not so much in use these days. So some definitions of kind of what it does. It's really a dialogue, kind of a ballet back and forth between the two parties, between the two systems, to do a verification. Another security technique, something called Kerberos, which is also a key, which is actually based on a symmetric key authentication protocol. It uses something called a key distribution technique. So Kerberos is pretty. I think it was developed by MIT a while back, and it's actually pretty. It's also embedded. You see it embedded in commercial products. So you're kind of a definition. Once again, it's a similar sort of. You log into the client authenticates, you generate a ticket, and then you receive a ticket based upon that. Then you authorize the authorization, and then client service request. So you can see there's a kind of a communication back and forth, authentication, verifying, and then using secured resources, and then ultimately getting a ticket at the end. Challenge you run into with this, though, it is potentially a single point of failure. If you lose your key distribution center, then everything stops. All right. Plus, also, there's an issue around use of timestamps. So you have to be within 10 minutes of synchronization accuracy, because it does use timestamps as part of its authentication. Now, one of the things that Microsoft uses Kerberos to do as part of its log on facilities. But I believe what they've done is because it operates some kind of within their domain, they have better control of their timestamps. And obviously, if you have a central resource with all your keys, if you compromise all the key, if you compromise that source, then you compromise all the keys. Mutual authentication, another approach. Two-way authentication, client and server verify each other's verification. This is what we see. We've talked about this with internet access. We talk with secure socket layer, SSL, and it's called TLS, which is, I think, the modern version of SSL. But basically, HTTPS will use a mutual authentication with the client, and where the two parties will, basically open the communication through a dialogue back and forth. They authenticate each other, and then it locks it encrypts the communication for the duration of the connection. So you see a lot of stuff with PKIs. Using a mechanism to achieve communications. Using PKI, a lot of times you see PKI as kind of embedded into things as opposed to just using it as a standalone system. Also, another means of authentication, X509 certificates. So basically, you present a certificate which is certified from an agency from an authentication authority, which is then is your basis for submitting. So long as the validity of the X509 certificate is not compromised, it is accepted as legitimate. Another thing you've seen with the stuff token access. So the idea of a very small device that kind of generates a number, which is the token, which is then combined with a password to log on. Right? So a lot of these things you've seen is set by timing. So the token will generate a key that will be valid for, say, 60 seconds. So when you log in, you enter the key, you enter your password, and so long as you do it within 60 seconds, you'll gain access. And then at the end of 60 seconds, that number will become deactivated, and then it'll generate a new number. So just continuous. So you operate. You basically you match the key. You generate a token, which is only good for a certain period of time. Biometrics. Basically, what is something you are. Some identifiable part of the body. So fingerprints, retinal scans are the most obvious ones we've seen. Voice recognition is another one that's out there as well. So it has to be unique. So the question is really, how do you define uniqueness, and how do you recognize uniqueness in the biometric? And that is everything we need to know about authorization, authentication, and access control.